Okay, so we're going to start our second session this afternoon with Dr. Karen Bentley from Lifeworks. So, as I said in the first session, everybody's bio is in the book. I'm not going to read it to you because you all can read. So, Dr. Bentley, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Karen. If you don't recognize Lifeworks, it's because we're a startup in Northern California, and we're working on botanical identification using DNA-based methods. And I'm really excited about the opportunity to talk in front of all of you today about genetic testing, because this is very much an emerging tool that is still growing and improving, and I really feel that unless we have these open discussions, that we're not going to be able to move forward as well as we could, and as if we were talking together. So, yeah. Oh, thank you. I don't want to fall off. That would be bad. So today I'm going to talk about the importance of sampling. There's a lot of questions about the technology and how well we can build a good genetic test, but the ability for us to build one of those that is both robust and accurate is entirely predicated on solid sampling. That genetic diversity really matters. And this is a really tough problem because we have a lot of species that we want to test for. It's not just the top 50, it's all of their sister species and common adulterants. And so the problem is really complex. And so with the FDA in 2015 having this study, I feel like a lot of people in the industry feel like genetics has been thrust upon them and they're just getting acquainted with it. And so I'd really like to take this opportunity to kind of understand or to explain the magnitude of the issue and how sampling is critical to surmounting this issue. One of the amazing things about our planet is that it is incredibly diverse. Since the Paleozoic, we've had an exponential increase in the number of species on our planet, and plants are no exception. We have had a relatively stable number of gymnosperm species over time, but as you can see, angiosperms have absolutely exploded. And from the 400,000 plant species on our planet, 30,000 of them have some sort of documented use. So if we're using them, that means that we might want to test for whether or not we have what we think we have. And for 30,000 species, that's quite a challenge. It would be amazing if we lived on a planet where all of these plant species were very similar, very similar, like clonal, so we could just pick one species and that would be it. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Diversity within species is really high. So, roses are a fantastic example. There are hundreds of varieties of roses being cultivated today. And if I wanted to create a genetic test that can tell me whether or not I have roses in my sample, I can't just choose, the first 3 yellow roses and incorporate that into my test. Because it might be that the other cultivars of roses are really genetically distinct. So if you give me a purple rose and I put it into my genetic test, it might come back as unknown, or it might come back as a sister species, something that's incorrect. So not only do we have many species that we want to be able to test for right now, but we have a huge array of genetic diversity within those species to complicate the problem. And to make that problem even more complicated, they're not all in one consolidated spot. They're all over the world. Species ranges can take over continents, they can cross continents, and so how do we capture genetic diversity to make a good genetic test? So genetics, where we are today, is that there are companies out there that do offer genetic testing, and they have thousands of plant species that they claim to test for. And so if you think of this figure where each of the lines at the end of the figure are different species, and the red dashes are what's been sampled, you would say, great, it looks like we have some options to figure out who's who. But if you were to ask that company or companies, how many individuals have been incorporated into your test to put that species on your website that you can test for it, typically you have 1 to 5 samples per species. And that might be fine for some species and being able to delineate who's who, but for other more complicated species or species complexes, it's not going to be enough sampling. So to put this into perspective, let's say that you are interested in having a genetic test for species X, and the current company says it can test for species X, and it has incorporated 3 samples into their genetic test to be able to offer that service. But unbeknownst to you, that only comes from one source, the green source. But you source your material from source 7, which is very genetically distinct. There's a possibility that you could come back with a result that you don't want. Specifically, an unknown result or a misidentification of species, a wrong result. So what I wanted to do today was take the opportunity to educate people who might be new to genetics on this limitation, this concern that we have as plant geneticists, which is the reality of sampling. What's the state of the sector now with sampling? What are the ramifications of limited sampling? And then how we as a community, as an industry, can work together to surmount this issue so that we can add genetics to the toolbox so that you can use it if you'd like to. The reality of sampling, of those 1 to 5 samples on average, is that it is extremely expensive. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to get your hands on reference material that you can incorporate into your test. I can't just go to the grocery store if I want to put elephant garlic into my test and pick some elephant garlic up there, extract DNA, put it into my test, and hit up all the grocery stores in town and do the same thing. I can't do that. I have to use authenticated samples that meet certain guidelines that are typically found in herbaria. I have to be able to have herbaria that are willing to reach out and work with us, and this is the same across all genetic testing service providers. And so having access to source material is a really big limiting step that can severely hinder the ability of a genetic testing service provider to develop a solid test. So access to source material all over the world is extremely needed. So this is where we are now, and this is where we're trying to go. 20 to 50 samples minimum per species that cover all across the species range. This might be overkill for some species, and it might be inadequate for others. It's really a species by species case. So now that we've kind of talked about the reality of how difficult it is to get proper sampling, let's talk about the ramifications. The first of which is that you have misidentification. You have black cohosh, let's say in reality it really is black cohosh, and you submit it to your genetic testing service provider and it comes back that it's not black cohosh. That would be wrong, would be incorrect. And so that's something that can happen from human error, process error, but really when it comes to sampling, not capturing sufficient genetic diversity to identify that sample correctly. That's a systemic problem to that genetic test, and it has to be recognized. Because if you're trying to find areas of the genome that are species specific, that can tell one species apart from the other, you have to be confident in those regions, and if you don't have enough data, it creates genetic misunderstandings. We think we found areas that can tell A and B apart, when really if we had more data, we would see that we don't. And this is a problem with not enough data, and it's completely solvable with sampling. So let's do an example. Let's continue with black cohosh. We have my computer's sliding. 2 species, black cohosh, Actia racemosa, and there's a sister species that's a common adulterant, Actia rubra, because they look a lot alike. And you want your genetic testing service provider to create a test that can tell them apart. So they go out to their local herbaria and they say, what samples do you have that we can use to put into our test? And let's say they say that, they have 3 samples from the southeast of the black cohosh range and 3 samples across the Actia rubra range. It's some place to start. So you go ahead and you make your genetic test, you find areas of the genome that can tell these 2 species apart, and then you try to validate this test by asking someone that you know who sources black cohosh to send you a sample. And they send you a sample from the northeast. And you put that into your genetic test and it comes back saying that it's Actia rubra. If it's actually black cohosh but it's coming back as Actia rubra, that's a wrong result. And having a physical document saying that something is misidentified, like something is something else, can make it where you feel like you can't use that material to begin with. So now you're in a pickle because, Maybe you know that it's black cohosh, but now you have documentation saying that it's not. What do you do there? So in this case, it's likely that you did not capture enough genetic diversity. You thought you found alleles, genes that were specific to just racemosa, when in fact you had alleles that either were found in rubra as well or more closely related to rubra. So the other aspect of this is that you can have an unknown result. So when your sample doesn't fall into any particular category, we can't identify it as black cohosh. And this is where genetics is different than chemistry. And this goes into sensitivity. When we're doing DNA testing picks up everything. When I'm extracting DNA from a sample, I'm not just extracting plant DNA. I'm extracting any DNA that's in there. So I'm picking up everything, sequencing everything. But I can only identify what I can look for. What does that mean? So if I have a database of just mint, then I can only tell you whether or not I have mint. If you look here, you give me a sample, and I have a solid database, or what I think is a solid database of reference material, and we get a result like this, which is something that people might have already seen. There might be 6,000 reads that says it's mint, 100 reads that says it's clover, and 1,000 reads that are unknown. What do you do with that result? Well, for all intents and purposes, your sample's mint. There's some clover contamination in there from when you were probably harvesting that mint. But what is that unknown? That unknown could be, maybe a feather got swept up as well, and you happen to pick up bird DNA. But you're a plant geneticist, so birds aren't in your database. That's going to come back as unknown, unless you look to outside databases. And even then, you still might end up with an unknown. So that's part of the reporting where you have to have discussions and dialogue and transparency with your genetic service provider, because you, as someone who's commercially responsible for your product, are going to look at that unknown and go, holy crap, what does that even mean? Like, what do I do with that? And so that's where dialogue is really important about understanding the test, how it's been created, what the sampling's like, and what are really the limitations of the test that you're using. And this is kind of where chemistry and genetics differ, because chemistry does this profile match my reference standards, and so you get that particular result in a profile, but with genetics you get all these different results, and it's how you interpret that result that can make all the difference. So how do we move forward? Really, it's you sample as many species of interest as you can, but you have to have really deep coverage of within species sampling, and you really have to thoroughly sequence those samples so that you can capture that genetic diversity, and it all has to come from vouchers of verified identity. And another thing that I think people haven't really been talking about yet, and I think is important to understand, is that your genetic testing service provider needs to have a platform that is created in an iterative process. If they commit to a platform that would cost them too much money to update, that's not a good provider, right? Because you want a company that continuously be adding in sample information to have as accurate as a platform as possible, where you develop the test, you validate it, and if something's missing, you go back and improve it. Where you have those starting samples, you take a sample to validate it. If it falls outside the scope of your test, you add more samples. If it continues to fall outside the scope of your test, you add more samples, until finally you get consistent results. You have a robust, accurate test. That's when you know that for that species, you've sampled sufficiently. So if there's anybody in industry that is here, this is how you can help, because this is the issue. Their global trade happens all over the world. And if you have access to materials, you have the ability to make voucher specimens of the things that you source. And if you want those things to be incorporated into a genetic test, then you should contemplate the idea of making authenticated samples of what you source, so that any genetics testing service provider that's out there can accurately test what you have every time. And since genetics is new to the industry and people have a lot of frustrations and not quite sure what to make of it, have these really honest conversations, feel them out, try to understand what their business values are, how they approach problems, and how transparent they are. You can ask questions like, how many samples have you incorporated into your test for this species? If the answer is proprietary, it's not proprietary. I can tell you that I've incorporated 15 samples into this test for this particular species and these many numbers of samples for their sister species. What you do with that information is simply to make the decision of whether or not you want to use that for your own business, whether or not that meets your business goals. And if it's not, then you can have that discussion with that company and say, hey, I would really love to stick with you, but I feel like your sampling's lax. And then you say, okay, well, let's try to work together to fix that. What specifically can they test for? What species of mint are included in that test and what are absent? How many loci do you use? Has this test been validated? And if you have something that comes back in a report that causes you consternation that you don't understand, or that comes back as wrong, how well are they going to help troubleshoot with you? Because that's really going to make all the difference as to whether or not this genetic tool helps you get where you need to go. Because all genetics is a tool. And you need to have a tool that works for you. So this all has to do with conversation and having that really good working relationship with your genetic provider as you start to understand how this sector works more and more. So with that, I'll take any questions you might have, and thank you for your time.
We do have time for one very quick question, and then we'll move on to Dr. Brown. Yeah, okay, hang on just a second.
Great presentation. Sampling is important. We all know that. I agree. I'm Jesse with NSF Authentic Technologies. One thing I didn't see on your list of things that you might want to provide to your client was the DNA sequence we heard in previous talks. I mean, depending on the technical nature of the client, is that of value or is that not? Is that more confusing? Where does that land in this whole spectrum of communication?
So, is there yes, that works. So, yeah, I think that the approach, your question is whether or not approach is important? Was that the question?
Yeah, just a question does having the sequence there have any value if you provide all the other information that you suggested in your talk?
Right.
Can it be more confusing? Because a QA manager wants to be able to say, release this or not, right?
Right.
So when is it data overload?
When is the data what?
When is it data overload, too, on these reports, right?
The data is overload when people don't know, people get back a report and they're not able to make heads or tails of it. Customizing a report to make it accessible for people is vital. And so if, for some people, they might not be interested in the results other than, I want this to work accurately every time, I don't want to know anything else that goes on with it, that's totally fine. But for people who are, right now apprehensive about genetic testing, kind of wading into the waters of how it works, asking about the platform and things like that, those are all good questions because at the end of the day, the idea that something is proprietary, they're not genetic testers, they're not going to go out and steal your ideas, they're just trying to figure out what to make of this report, So the idea that, I think if you have that open dialogue and solid reports that, you can make a lot of headway, and being really transparent about what your test can do and can't do is vital. And I think particularly in this platform, if you think about it being an education panel, just stating that, from a genetic testing service provider to everyone here, of having that transparent conversation is worthwhile having, then hopefully more people will have it.
I totally appreciate hearing that. Once upon a time, we were talking about chemical analysis, and that was the thing that everybody was talking about. And I kept getting contract labs saying to me, stop telling everybody we have to give our methods. I'm like, oh, but you do. You have to share your methods with your clients. You have to be open and transparent. This is about regulatory compliance. Your method's not that special. Right? They don't. But anyway, now we do. Right? We share methods. We have official methods programs, and I think that ultimately it puts it at a different level of quality assurance.
Okay, so this is Dr. Paula Brown. She's Associate Dean of Applied Research at the British Columbia Institute of Technology in Vancouver, British Columbia. So, Dr. Brown, to you.
Thanks. So we didn't really have talk titles, so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what my talk title was going to be. Probably more time than I should have. And I think what I'm talking about is and what we are talking about is botanical quality assurance and GMP compliance method selection, and fitness for purpose. And so what this is really about is ensuring that you have that connectivity between the materials, what it is you're testing, the method that you're using, and the specification that you're trying to meet. I'm going to just pull this because, I never know what anyone else is going to say, and I'm one of those people that I'm always changing my slides right up until I give a talk because, you just gave a great talk on sampling, so I don't have to mention that, but it's still in here. So, but one thing that people didn't say is they didn't put up the regulatory compliance. So CFR 111, you must have product specifications that include test methods and tolerances for identity, purity, and strength. One part, and people talk about this all the time, one thing they often forget is 111.75, where it says you must conduct at least one appropriate test. And I just wanted to highlight this because we don't talk that much about how many tests are enough, which one should we do, is one enough, and how do you know if that one test you're doing is enough or you do need to do something else. In addition, they put significant emphasis on scientifically valid. I'm still not entirely sure what that means, but 111.320 states you must verify that the lab examinations and testing methodologies are appropriate for intended use. And this one, I do know what it means, because this is my favorite thing in the whole world. Appropriate for intended use means the method has been fit for purpose. It is fit for use. Now, I just spent the last week at AOAC, and I know a lot of other people in this audience have too, because I'm seeing them. I've got Stefan, who's chairing Echinacea, Stephen, Kava, Scudellaria, Holly, myself. And we get into these meetings, and the first thing that the statisticians and the staff at AOAC want is they want a fitness for purpose statement. Fitness for purpose statement is the first step, except it's not. And I'll never forget my very first expert review panel a ridiculously long time ago. And there was a member on the panel who wasn't an analytical chemist, but is a brilliant man, Roy Upton, who said, yeah, so before we get to all that, what is the purpose of this? And that I think is something that we often forget. We need to talk about fit for what purpose before we establish what that fitness for purpose statement is, right? You need to think about, why are we doing this? What is the analytical endpoint? Are we talking about raw material acceptance? Are we talking about an in-process control for manufacturing? Is this finished product release? Right? How does that relate? So then, once you figure that out, you can start to think about, well, is your method going to answer that question that you have? Right? Is it going to conform to your identity specifications? Are the specifications adequate? Which is a very different question. So I'll talk a little bit about identity specifications. I thought, oh, how hard can it be? I always say these things. It's like when I was going to do an analytical method for Hawthorne. How hard could it be? Oh, hybridizers. Anyway, statement of diagnostic feature. It's an analytical method and the tolerances. This is the requirement. So what is your objective? Is it to ensure that the component is the correct species and plant part? Or is it to ensure the component is derived from the correct plant part and species? And what I heard earlier is that maybe DNA barcoding might work for the first one, but not so much for the second one. Right? Or maybe it's ensure the component is as described in the specification, which is often things like an isopropanol extract of H. perforatum spray dried onto maltodextrin. Right? Because if that is your specification, then that is the identity that you have to demonstrate. And that is probably not going to be one test. Right? I like to use this as an example of specifications. It's a specification from the Japanese pharmacopoeia for ephedra seneca, and I stole this from Dr. Betts a long time ago, and I still keep using it because I like it. It says no more than 5% woody stems and zero tolerance for grasses and other plants. That is the specification. And as far as I'm concerned, visual inspection is a scientifically valid method for this. You pull it out, you point, there's the grass, there's the woody stems. And that's great if you get it in a bag of raw material like this. And this is a good way to ensure it. This is a fit for purpose for that. But, and we get confused about this a lot, and I think some of the papers that came out in DNA and some of the conversations get confused. This is not a specification for identity. This is a specification for foreign matter content. We need to stop confusing identity and purity, right? Those are different measures, different approaches that you're going to have to take. So back to method selection. It needs to be specification driven, right? Your specification includes the method. It's actually a part of the specification. So it's really important that we don't lose sight of that when we're starting to figure out which method is going to be the right one to pick. You need to consider, is it going to be appropriate for your matrix? the stage of processing, the way your finished product is put together? Is it going to achieve reliable results within the specification range? Don't forget, these are ranges, right? That you have to have tolerances in a specification. Can you authenticate a material? What is the confidence level in that assignment? If you've decided that yes, that's your answer is yes. With what level of confidence? Is that a 95% confidence interval, 100? Which don't tell me it is, because don't go there, right? Because it's still a measure. And does your method exclude known adulterants, and at what detection level, if that's a part of your specification or your concern? An analytical method, and this is one thing that I think we also have to remember, that sometimes it might be appropriate for one endpoint, but not for another. And I'm going to use the example of nonspecific determination of broad classes of compounds, because this happens a lot in this industry, but also a lot of the assays in monographs include nonspecific assays. But they're not standalone, right? The whole idea of the monograph, and keeping in mind that concept of Life 1, monographs have a whole lot of different tests. So that assay isn't an identity test. They have a description of the identity. And it's not that chemical assay. And what happens when you pluck stuff out, it does not go well. I like this example only because, as a chemist, it's so unfair. The botany people get all the really pretty pictures in their slides, and it's so much more interesting to look at. So I'm picking anthos because they're colorful. So here we have an anthocyanin. I think this is cyanin 3-glactoside. And basically, it's much easier if you cut off those sugars. Sugars are a pain in the butt. They make everything complicated and difficult. And it's much cheaper and easier and faster if you just measure the aglycones. Unfortunately, if this was meant to be an identity assay, that's not going to work, because you're not going to be able to tell the difference between an apple and a cherry. Now, of course, you can look at the apple and the cherry and you know that they're different. If you have the diagnostic morphological characteristics intact, like, hey, this is my apple and this is my cherry, it works really well. But if this is just a powder, who knows, right? So this is going to be not fit for purpose. Now, there are other approaches. Don't cut off the sugars, right? Anthocyanins tend to be very specific to the material, and so that might be a more fit for purpose method. I'm not saying it is, might be. So the bottom line, I think, is that the more highly processed a material it is, the less likely it is that you're going to have a physical examination in order to definitively identify the material. And as soon as we move away from those physical examinations and those diagnostic characteristics that are so a part of how we identify plants, we're moving into an area where we're no longer doing a primary analysis. It's a surrogate, right? Or I think Wendy Applequist calls it a proxy method. So you're substituting this use of a DNA test or a chemical test from what would normally be, right, an organoleptic and morphological or whatever test for botanical ID. And so what we end up with is because we don't trade in materials that have their diagnostic characteristics intact, we force ourselves to have this entire hierarchy of testing protocols that we're going to need to deal with the actual forms and commerce that we have. And so we've made it very difficult for ourselves. Gives us a lot to do, though, which is great. I was going to give another example of identity specification. So here's one. And for the most part, most of the analytical assays that are developed, they were not developed, especially outside the published literature, but they were not developed for identity. There are a few cases where it actually works. So here we have Panax ginseng on the top, Panax quinquefolius, and even outside of the characteristic ginsenoside levels that you see, you have the presence of RF, and that makes it easy to identify that. Now, this falls apart if it could potentially be mixed. It completely falls apart, right? So the idea that you can use this chemical method if you have mixtures is not going to work. Now, there's other things you can do. So we gotta keep throwing away our chemometrics. It's so much fun these days. This is a Pca Score Plot, and so we can look at it. And if you take the time, you can do all the mixtures, and you can validate the model. And it takes way more samples that I'm showing here to show that you can consistently identify, and you can determine your detection limit, which for us we found out to be, I think about 10%, because even 5 to 0 is not differentiatable, even using mathematical models. I put in this one too, so this is my bolometric versus chemometric. So I received a material that was a Panax ginseng root extract standardized to 7% ginsenosides. And I am not a routine contract test lab, It's just someone just asked me to look at it. So I'm like, oh, okay. And it came out as the top, and I could say, okay, well, it is a powdered extract. And it is standardized to 7% insecticides, but it is not ginseng root. Right? Well, some leaf, all leaf, not totally just leaf. Like there's still all RF and so it's like, so this is the kind of stuff. So maybe this is where we talk about, other types of methods that you have to consider. And it's not really about an identity specification. This is talking about when you have, commonly anticipated deleterious substances or reasonably anticipated, or if there's a known adulteration out there, it needs to be considered. But anyway, just an example. And you find it mostly in extracts. And again, if you do your due diligence and you can build your model and you can quantify the amount of leaf adulteration in a material if that's what you want to do, right? So maybe if your specification says, I will not have any leaf material, then that might be something that you want to do. And apparently, there might be other ways of doing this as well. So back to method selection and validation. So I think one thing that we also need to recognize is that there are very few methods in the published literature that have been validated, let alone actually even optimized, right? A lot of what comes into the published literature comes from academia, and they have no understanding of quality assurance and quality control and what's required in an industrial setting, right? I think about my master's degree. You synthesize I was doing natural product synthesis. You make it, you report your highest recovery. No one's ever going to repeat that. Right, but that's just how it goes. But with method validations, I think there's a real paucity in training and understanding of what the steps are and what you have to do to ensure a method is fit for purpose. And it is important because validation is how we measure uncertainty and how we measure confidence, right? It's how we feel when we're making these decisions. And for companies, this is money decisions. This is a huge impact. This isn't like, oh yeah, so we did our test and it was negative. Oh, that could be for any number of reasons. No, they have to reject a lot of money's worth of material based on that determination you make. That is a huge responsibility that I think that the analytical contract labs and the DNA testing labs need to understand, right? There's a lot at stake for these companies. Okay, so quantitative validation. This is pretty boilerplate: selectivity, linearity, accuracy, precision, repeatability, not to be confused with reproducibility, which you can only get with multiple labs, limits of detection and quantification, and analyte stability, often overlooked, but definitely a part of validation. But we're not actually talking about quantitative methods, at least I don't think we are. We're talking about a qualitative method. And really, I know in Joe's opening paragraph, he talked about validation, and you should, look at ISO or IUPAC or AOAC. Oh, okay, but there actually is not a lot of guidance out there for validating qualitative methods, right? There are certainly statistical algorithms and approaches that can be taken, but there's not a very prescriptive guide that makes it really easy for you to go about doing that. One that was produced, the Office of Dietary Supplements supported the AOAC in putting together a group to talk about botanical identification methods and how we might go about doing a validation. And what they came up with was the probability of identification. I put the reference there. I'm assuming people will have access to the slides. But it's based on having an inclusivity and an exclusivity panel, and you calculate in your validation the false positive and false negative rate. And then there's a lot of statistics and complication in there. The challenge I have with this is the inclusivity, exclusivity part. Because the ability of a method to correctly identify the target material is a part of your identity specification. And that panel really, in your inclusivity sampling frame, has to include everything that you expect to give a positive result. So that is not one sample. Right? We've already talked about species and subspecies and cultivars and growing conditions, all these different things that can have an impact on the material. And you just gave a fabulous talk about the huge diversity in the plant population. And so if you're going to have an inclusivity sampling frame, 10, 20, 50, like how many samples and how are you going to determine that? Right? And so I think I was thinking about sampling. I meant to talk about reference materials, but I got stuck at sampling, and I'm so glad you gave such a great talk. I really appreciated that. I think we need the objectives of the sampling purpose to be, we need it to be very clear. the purpose of sampling, the laboratory analysis and taken, and the characteristics of the ingredients, the materials are all connected, and that is all a part of how you develop your specification and select your method. And I only had one real or two slides about samples and populations. So you've talked about populations. So that's the whole of the material whose properties you're trying to estimate as a reference, right, to the population. The sample is that small piece that you're taking, and it's supposed to represent that population. And then your lab sample, which I don't tend to use that word, this is taken from FAO, but we usually say test article, right? So your test article is only a small fraction of your sample. That's the reality. And so, the primary objective of your sample selection is to ensure that the properties of that lab sample, that test article, are representative of the properties of the population. So can we do that? Can we really effectively do that with the kind of technology that we're talking about and with the way that we're collecting materials and the number of references that we have? I'm not sure. I won't talk more much about this, but I think it is we need to understand that when we do this, and we have to, because we can't run thousands of samples, not chemically, not DNA-wise, that doesn't make any sense. But we do have to remember that it is just an estimate of the true value of the whole population, especially when we're talking about identity. So this is about DNA, this session, and I'm not a molecular scientist. I will not even pretend to be one. But I felt like I needed to put something about DNA in here. So this is somebody else's paper, not mine. It's just plant DNA isolation from honey. And there's lots of examples out there in the literature. So they looked at different kits, different matrices, different pretreatments. So this is what they did. Different treatments, different extractions. And what they found was variability, depending on the pretreatment and depending on the extraction. And they found that the purity varied significantly by extraction, and in each sample they found anywhere from not detected to a significant amount of DNA. And this was, echoed in the earlier talks by people who know much more than I do. But I think it's to me, it was about recognizing that there are important factors, that this is a complex procedure, and the more steps you have in a procedure, the more likelihood you have of having false positives, cross-contamination, or introducing error or uncertainty, right? So you're looking at the analyte extraction, interfering analytes, what the material looks like, potential binding complex, no different than when you're doing a chemical assay. Like I'm looking at this going, this is really no different. Right? I think what I would really like to see, if we're going to have DNA analysis in a quality control setting, I'd like there to be a recognition that there are basic requirements for molecular identification. So extraction, PCR, gel electrophoresis, maybe I'm way oversimplifying this. But I want to see protocols around each of these steps. I want to see guidance protocols around those steps. And I want them each to be given the same consideration that you would give in any analytical method when you're trying to determine the fitness. I want to see that validation guideline for this type of assay. Because when you don't do that, you can't interpret the data. You can't get reproducible results, certainly not lab to lab. And that certificate of analysis that is meant to describe the quality control data for a particular lot or batch of material, because I'm bringing this back to the companies, okay, is reliant on the methodologies and the tools that perform those tests. And if you haven't done that due diligence, you don't have those protocols hammered down, you don't know what your uncertainty is and what your confidence in your result is, that C of A is meaningless. And you could cost a company a lot of money, or even their business. And I feel like people need to be conscientious of that. There is error in every measure. And as I mentioned earlier, 100% pass, that's not reality when you're doing analysis. There is always some error, so there's always going to be some uncertainty. There's always going to be some kind of confidence interval that you have to state. Specifications include tolerances, right? And that's all a part of it. And I think I would like to have maybe a little more meaningful dialogues about what kind of confidence and what we can expect when we're getting data back. That's all. This is actually, I thought this was neat because this was just published actually on my birthday in June of this year. And there was actually a special edition in Planta Medica that talks about a whole lot of different aspects of plant quality assurance. But one of the papers in there was talking about DNA barcoding for industrial quality assurance. And I reproduced this. It's a chart that indicates the steps involved in a normal DNA barcoding workflow. And I would assume that you would have the same thing for if you're not doing, I'm still confused between the barcoding, not barcoding thing, but whatever way you're doing it, you're going to have a workflow, right? And when you do that, you're going to have quality control decision points, right? And if you look at this, you're going to see all the red circles are decision points, right? So you can count them. There's like, 18, 19 circles, but really it represents 9 different critical control points where a decision is made, right? Where there has to be something done to ensure that you have a positive outcome, right? These are all places where you have a step in the process where you're introducing uncertainty. Now, ultimately, this is just a clip from the paper so that people could see it. Ultimately, what they said was that the nature of plant materials and the demands of industrial quality control procedures mean that conventional DNA barcoding is probably not the method of choice for an industrial control application. And I'm not entirely sure that that's true. I don't know enough about it. It seems like if you do have fresh materials, depending on what your intent is, it might be quite appropriate. They did make some suggestions that DNA could be a very valuable, because it goes on, but but I can't read the whole paper to you. But there's work that needs to be done, and we need to modify and change the way that we look at it. And maybe barcoding isn't the way, and I think that's pretty much echoes what Dr. Newmaster was saying, that it's not really going to work in this context, but we do have other options available to us, and that's great. But I want to see this. So I don't. To me, it doesn't matter if you're doing multiple small fragments or you're doing this. I still want to see that flow chart that shows me where the critical control points are, and I want to see the uncertainty, right? So here's my key messages. The process by which you demonstrate a method is appropriate for use or fit for purpose is a validation. We need to do them. There's uncertainty in every measure. Reference materials are the key. We didn't spend a lot of time talking about them, but I think you can see from the talk previous to mine that we do have a huge amount of genetic diversity and plant diversity. And this is important for our chemical methods as well, especially as people are getting all fancy and developing chemometric models. Well, I've seen ridiculous sampling for developing those chemometric models. I'm seeing algorithms being used that are completely inappropriate for authentication, and I'm seeing no diagnostics and no validation or bootstrapping of these methods. Right, so I'm not picking on DNA, right? It's everywhere, but I just want to see more validation, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, and I really feel strongly that these details of the methodology and our approaches need to be disclosed, because ultimately, the companies that are your clients, they're not just paying you that whatever few $100s for analysis. They're paying you as a part of their livelihood of their company. Right? And at the end of the day, that information that you're giving them, they're making business decisions based on it. And so I think we need a little more transparency. I also think it's going to be very difficult to get to that point where we have that guidance for the protocols and steps if we don't have more explanation and more discussion. I'd love to see some guidance documents published. They are for all kinds of chemical assays, so I don't know why they wouldn't have that for DNA assays. I mean, maybe it's just a little too early stage. And of course, at the end of the day, it all starts with the plant. It really comes back to the plant, and plants are so fun but so annoying. I should have gone into a different testing method. So I just have to give a quick acknowledgement, just because if every time I give a talk I don't mention the Canada Research Chair Program, NSERC, or AFC, then I'll never get funded again, and I can't keep doing this fun stuff. I work with an awesome team of people. I have a fairly large applied research group, as well as a basic research group. Some of the data that was thrown in here came from Dr. Chan, Jamie, and Dr. Liu, my grad students, Jensen and Beth, right now. And more than anything, thank you so much for the opportunity to present as part of the AHPA Botanical Congress. It's my first time. I wish I could have attended the entire Congress. I'm going to make a point to make sure I get to do that next year, but I really do appreciate the invitation to participate, especially since I have no DNA background. Thank you.
Okay. Now, actually, before we move on to our final speaker, I'll give you time for one question for Dr. Brown when we get a slide presentation. Anybody? Anybody? Class?
Clear as mud.
Class? Okay, Bob. Class?
Thanks, Bob.
So I'm one of the people in the audience that really appreciate the chemical structure they put up. I think that's just as pretty as all the pretty plants that we had. So just to get that out there. What I like about the fit for purpose language is that it allows you to add new technologies as they come along.
Of course it does.
Absolutely. But one of the challenges with new technologies is they bring lots of questions, right? So, and whether it be DNA or whether it be other type of high-end analytical approaches, you often have uncovered new things, lots of unknowns that come out in your samples. And from your perspective, what do we do with new technologies? Gives you all this information that provides all these unknowns.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's amazing that the more advanced our technology gets, it's very hard to restrain yourself because you can just get more and more data, and I'm an alchemist and I love the data. And then suddenly you have all this data and you're like, oh, okay, I can't even open the file because it keeps crashing my computer. And how is that helpful? And I think for me, it's what I try to focus on, at least certainly in my applied research program, because I can just go nuts in the basic research, but with the applied research program where I'm, really the goal is to ensure that we have higher quality products in the marketplace. It's really about giving industry those tools that they should have had, right? It's just that, regulations and GMP came in and they didn't have a big book of methods. I mean, I wasn't always in the dietary supplement, natural health product world. I spent years doing environmental chemistry and forensic chemistry, and I had this awesome book O methods. Right, so there was no confusion. I'm going to measure testosterone in meat. I know exactly where I'm turning to, and I know what the certification is, and I have a reference standard, and I have a proficiency material, right? And we don't have that. So I think you really need to kind of apply Occam's razor to your data and to your approaches if you really want to affect positive change in the industry and support and help the industry. And to me, Occam's razor means like keep it simple, right? So new technologies are great if they're developed with the thought in mind that this is going to answer a very specific question that is plaguing the industry. And I think those questions need to come from the industry, not from the scientists. And I think that's part of it. Like as academics, we're always pushing, and it needs to not be that, right? I think, industry needs to have a voice if we're going to go around saying that we're going to solve industry's problems. Well, we need to know what they are first. And I think sometimes we forget that.
Okay, thank you. With that, we'll move on to Dr. Majid Sheriff, who's the Chief Science Officer of the American Herbal Products Association. And he'll be talking about a joint industry government initiative that's funded by the Office of Dietary Supplements at NIH in partnership with the National Institute of Standards and Technology and supported also by the American Herbal Products Association. Thank you, Majid.
So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for staying behind. Before I start, I'd like to let you know that I'm not talking science. I will actually, as Joe mentioned, that I will be previewing with you a study that we are conducting in collaboration with the United States National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. So again, it is for this, I would like to start with a background, which is the study is basically will be looking into how much DNA testing will be of service to us with the people who are working in the herbal industry. Is it true or not, and how much of use we can draw out of this technology? So with this, I'd like to remind you that all of this excitement started after some activities that came out of the Office of the New York State Attorney General. And if you remember, that was in early 2015, and before that, DNA was there. People were using it, and some people who are working in the DNA testing for botanicals were really trying hard to promote the technology and to promote their service. Until 2015, then everything became out. There was so much excitement. And we were really caught by surprise, frankly. And then we started looking into how much of this is real. So in order to understand, we need to look into the history. I mean, specifically, what is the history of DNA testing within the Office of the Attorney General of the New York State? And this is that's why I'm saying mostly I will not be talking science, but I'd like to come with you to a understanding where we are today because of what happened 2 years ago. And I will leave you to draw the conclusion after I conclude the review of this history with you. So you will be drawing your own conclusion. So the DNA testing as a technique, as a tool, was introduced first for forensic, medical diagnostic, and paternity testing around the 1985. By the year 1999, the New York Attorney General, and at that time was Elliot Spitzer, was hired a special counsel to look into introducing DNA testing as a tool within the New York State criminal justice system, mostly for criminal investigation. So that was in 1999, 2000, and then in 2000 he made a statement in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee saying that such standards, DNA standards, are needed to help ensure the integrity of the criminal justice system, of course, in New York State. Then between 2001 2016, the excitement or the interest in DNA testing within the Office of the Attorney General at New York State was still picking up, and Spitzer was promoting the development of a database of DNA for criminals and terrorists, and also later on, he asked it to expand it and add more samples into this database. By 2006, late 2006, he was elected the governor of New York State, and he moved out. He left the Attorney General, and this is when Andrew Cuomo assumed the position of the Attorney General of New York State. And also the interest in DNA testing continued within the Office of the Attorney General, and still focusing on medical diagnostic, forensic investigation, and paternity testing. Again, Cuomo became elected as the governor of New York State and has assumed the office in 2011. At that time, Eric Schneider took the position of the New York State Attorney General in 2011. And he continued on the same track using DNA testing as a tool for forensic investigation, medical diagnosis, and also paternity testing. And the office was able to solve some of the old crimes using DNA analysis. In 2014, the Attorney General proposed a new regulation that he called it the Unjust Imprisonment Act, which intended to allow people who were wrongly convicted in New York State to sue the state to sue the state because of the wrong indictment. In 2015, there was a surprise move. All of a sudden, in February 2015, we saw and during the year 2015, there were 6 announcements, 6 activities coming out of the New York Attorney General office, all related to DNA testing, and all were directed at our community, the herbal industry. And 2 of these included 2 letters of cease and desist for the sale, distribution, and marketing of products. So he targeted some companies. Later in the year, Mr. Schneiderman and also the Indiana Attorney General announced the formation of a bipartisan Attorney General group of 14 members, and they called for the launch of a comprehensive inquiry into the herbal industry. So again, there was a major shift. That year witnessed a major shift in the implementation of DNA technology within the Attorney General office at New York State, and that also brought this excitement in DNA testing within our community. Between 2015 and 2016, the Attorney General signed agreement with NBTY and GNC and Nature's Way, and I quote that the agreement was to initiate key industry reforms, in addition also to perform DNA barcoding as part of their approach, those companies' approach to assuring authenticity. The situation was so strange, and to the extent that some of the adamant critics of our industry came to our rescue. So we saw that Dr. Cohn at Harvard University commented that the Attorney General test results were so extreme that Dr. Cohn, found that these results are hard to accept. He also said that it was possible that the test had failed to detect some plants even when these plants were present because the manufacturing process resulted in the complete destruction of the DNA material. And also around same time in 2015 and following an inquiry from Senators Hatch and another senator, I don't remember who was that, but around the same time the FDA commented on their inquiry, saying that the FDA, the agency, does not use DNA testing currently within the agency as a method for plant identification agency-wide. In addition, also, the FDA wrote back that if the FDA were to use DNA testing as a method of analysis for extracts, FDA will be complementing this method of analysis, DNA testing, with other more established technology, chemical technologies. So this also around the same time we heard objection to the actions of the Attorney General from so many interested parties and also from almost, I believe, from all members of the industry associations. And around the same time, 1 year later, in March 2000, or actually it was a month later, where the AHPA and CRN, UNP, and CHPA commissioned the publication of a white paper. And this white paper is available on our website, and you have the link there. This white paper looked into the capabilities and limitation of DNA barcoding as a tool for botanical dietary supplement identification. So this brings us to where we are today. I mean, we have so much excitement. We have a major session within the Botanical Congress talking about DNA. We have seen so many publications talking about DNA testing for botanicals, and we really don't know. I personally don't know how much DNA testing is valuable to us as members of our community. So we would like to know and understand what is the reality of this. And this is where we started in March 2017 by a request from our members of the 3 technical committees at AHPA. They asked us to look into what is the reality of the DNA testing when it comes to botanical identification. So we looked around. We thought NIST is the right place. They have the infrastructure. They have the expertise. They have been doing the dietary supplement quality assurance program for so many years, and they have the infrastructure. So we approached NIST. We asked them whether there would be interest. The staff there were interested, and then they approached their superiors and got the approval. So now we have an approval to work with NIST under NIH-ODS and also with AHPA to look into the reality of DNA testing. We formed a working group from members of our community and also from experts in DNA testing. And this working group developed the scope of the project. We started planning for the project, and also we invited participation. So far, we have 15 participants. All of these participants has in-house capabilities of DNA testing. So this was a requirement. You need to do your own testing. These 15 participants include, as you can see, 8 testing labs, 3 universities, 2 dietary supplement manufacturers, 1 DNA equipment manufacturer, and also the lab at FDA CIFSAN will be one of the participants. We decided to start the first exercise. We will be looking into ginkgo leaf, and we know that it is a unique species. It is easy. It will be easy for the DNA labs to identify it. But we wanted to use this as the beginning of the study, and also we're looking into not only ginkgo leaves, but also based on the information you heard today, that there could be a possibility of differentiated between plant parts using DNA technology. So we would like to really see whether this is whether this new research information will be of help to us or not. So we're thinking of including ginkgo stem, and also we'll be looking into substituents, other plants that are used as substituents for ginkgo, Saphora japonica, etc. So with this, we announced the sign up for this study that was open on September 15 days back, 2 weeks back, and it will continue till end of October. And the samples will be sent to participants by beginning of December. You have the link to the sign up on this slide. So with this, I will like to stop here and thank you for your attention. I would just like to say a few concluding remarks for this. So again, we're looking into better understanding of where are we with this technology, DNA testing, and whether this technology will be of service to us, people working in the herbal industry. We also believe that with all of the excitement, with what came out of the New York Attorney General office, I personally believe that it may have some, it had some negative impact on our industry, but I believe that as a scientist and also as a member of the industry, I believe that it also has its positive effect, because now not only that money is now directed toward research and development in the DNA testing when it comes to botanicals, we'll start seeing startup opening facilities to look into DNA testing of botanicals. So hopefully by the end we will be able to, we'll get another reliable tool that we can use as another tool for service of our industry. Thank you.
Okay, before I open the floor to questions, I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank AHPA. I want to thank you for your attention and your endurance. And I want to thank the technical team as well. This is about one of the most flawless meetings that I've moderated at, and I go to a lot of meetings. So thank you guys. Appreciate it. So we have the room for another 20 minutes. I'm not going to nail anybody to their seats and make them stay for 20 minutes. As soon as the last question is done, we're out of here. But I don't want to stop the discussion either. As I said before, I think the discussion is usually the most valuable part of these things. So with that, I'll open the floor to questions. Okay.
We're missing a couple speakers up here. Like, sort of.
Thank you. So I also want to thank AHPA and Majid and whoever was on the planning committee for this, for having a session on DNA. If you're, like Stacy and think it's totally useless, or if you're, one of the existing labs making claims that it's the only tool you'll ever need, wherever you fall on that spectrum, it's here, and it's in our industry, and it's confusing, and people have a lot of questions about it, and so I think that this is a great forum to get people from industry and the academics to be able to kind of start sorting some of those things out. I really wish that Eric Schneiderman would have ever heard Paula's talk, because, to me, it is the biggest example of using a not fit for purpose method that exists, right? And this actually had criminal type implications. So all those points are really well taken. So I just want to put it open to anyone on the panel who may have opinions, and maybe it's unanswerable, but we, 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have established, validated, standard HPLC methods either, right? So I feel like this is kind of in its infancy. Well, to a certain extent. So I feel like, this is kind of in its infancy, and it's up to all of us to contribute and say, hey, here is what we feel like needs to be, and just starting, included in a standard type method or such for these applications. And keeping in mind that it is specification driven, right? And so these methods are going to be different per application. But maybe where I think a lot of the confusion is, just to start, what are some of the common things, and Nandu had a comment about this earlier, what are some of the things that we should kind of start demanding from our testing providers to say, here's what we would like to see as a consumer? And again, if your specification includes cornstarch, it's not going to surprise you that there might be corn DNA in your sample, right? And I heard Dr. Newmaster say earlier, there's incidental DNA or whatever you want to call it, things like foreign organic matter. These are things that need to be sussed out. And personally, from a service provider, I would want to know, how are you setting these tolerances, and how are you, figuring out what is incidental and what is acceptable, and that kind of thing. And so to me, that's something as an industry or a consumer I would want to see on a C of A. So, and maybe if you guys up here, the experts, can kind of give some suggestions to us in industry about what we should be asking for and demanding on these C of A's in analysis.
Okay. I just want to make a comment about that, though. The tolerances and the requirements are set by industry, not by us. Right? It's your specifications, it's not ours. What we do need to be able to disclose, though, is whether our methodology can fit within that tolerance, like if it fits within that purpose. And so what we need to be talking about is what our confidence levels and our uncertainty is in the measure.
Exactly, and that's what I meant.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify, because when you say tolerances, I'm like, little different.
So please clarify as well, because again, I heard Dr. Newmaster say this morning, we might have to say, exclude something that might be up to 10% of the DNA reads we would get or something too, because these are natural products. They grow out in the world. There's going to be a lot of different DNA there. And then with the increasing sensitivity of the techniques, how do we make those distinctions? And I think personally it should be, data-based with acceptance criteria.
I really like the sampling.
It's really sensitive, so I think if you just
I'll just give a response to this idea of incidental DNA, and who knows if it's the right term. There's a lot of DNA that's found in samples, and the DNA can be amplified at different rates according to evolutionary processes and PCR bias. And some of the results I've reviewed from industry that has come from technology that's very sensitive has picked up some of these small amounts of DNA, I suspect, and they're concerned that they had a contaminant, and they may not have had a contaminant. So we started running experiments. Let's mix a bunch of very small amounts of plant material with a lot of one ingredient and run it on some of these sensitive technologies and see what we get. And we definitely get over-amplification. And sometimes the main ingredient doesn't even show up in these tiny amounts in 1%, show up huge numbers of reads. And this is particularly a problem with NextGen. It can be corrected with algorithms, but we need to consider this other DNA that's found in there. And there may be ways to quantify it and have a cutoff level based on some quantification curves. I don't know, but we certainly need to start thinking about it and how to do it.
It's a short list of things that I think you might want to demand from your service provider. You want to know where the references and sequences come from, not only which plants, which kind of populations, numbers, and you also want to know not just the thing that you're targeting, but the things that are related to it. Make sure that they're included in the analysis. Ideally, you may or may not want to actually see the sequences, but I think as someone who is, shall we say, victim or beneficiary of a certificate of analysis, you should have the right to see the sequences. I know some providers will give them to you and some will not, and it is painful to analyze them, but you should at least have the ability to see them if you need to.
I would argue that in terms of incidentals and then what questions to ask your provider, just making sure that your provider has an incredible number of resources to show how they've validated, that they've really done a good job of validating their protocols and that they're showing those reports, and that, if you're, it's like that A versus B question I think that you had up, if you're looking for is this in here or not versus, what's in here, and that's when you're going to get your incidentals, seeing if they've done, experiments to really know how well their protocol deals with that and putting that up there so that whoever is using them can make the decision for themselves. I think that's just good business,
I would add one other thing, which is depending on the technology they're using, you want to make sure that they're using negative controls. I know some people don't because it's more expensive, but that would be.
The sampling issues that you brought up that earlier around environmental influences. My question is, are we at a place right now where on plastid loci that you could actually identify where environmental influences show up as some adaptive sequence feature so that you could kind of pull that out, clean that out of the fragments that you were looking at? Does that make sense? Am I being clear? So environmental influences are having some effect on the underlying base pair sequences. And they're showing up in terms of identifying one species over another. can we identify how and where environmental influence shows up in the plastid genome so that we can eliminate that from sampling issues?
So there's there's I think a couple things that you're bringing together that actually are different separate issues. So so one thing is that, DNA is DNA. It can change by random mutation, and environment can have effects on methylation patterns and things like that. But, I get this question a lot from people who are more, they've had more background in chemistry. DNA is DNA is DNA. But when you look across a geographic landscape, that's when genetic diversity comes into play. And that can be driven by the environment, but that's just reality, that's just life. There's that variation that you just incorporate, and you recognize that diversity does make up that species variation on a genetic level, and then you just build that into your test. So it's not really something that you would remove or standardize against. That's just the beautiful biodiversity of life that you then incorporate into your genetic test.
Right. So I think that's kind of when I was talking about setting up your inclusivity panel, right? So if you're going to validate your method, you want to include that you have everything that's okay. So if this is about an identity specific, to get back to specifications, if your specification that it's echinacea purpurea aerial, you want to make sure that in your reference and your inclusivity and your exclusivity, you have enough material that's going to represent what that diversity might be, right? It's going to be way worse for chemistry, honestly. Like plant secondary metabolites are ridiculous, right? So I think it's totally feasible, right? I mean, I have much more confidence in the ability to validate some of these approaches, I think, than the number of samples I would compute you would have to calculate in a power calculation for doing chemometrics and metabolomic and chemical profiling. They've grossly underestimated the number of samples required to make that cloud of this is yes and this is no. So.
Okay. Sure.
I just get confused about the actual sequence.
And this is maybe more of a comment than a question. So I think we can all agree that the ability for us to gather data, whether through DNA or other types of analytical tools, is increasing pretty much exponentially, the amount of information we can get on the biomass that we're doing. One of the other tools that we're not talking about in this community yet, but it's growing in other communities, is the ability to use tools like artificial intelligence and deep learning to understand this complex data is growing even faster than our area. One of the challenges in that space, and it's a challenge that I've heard here today, is the ontology, the descriptors, everyone using common language so that when machines go to learn from information that they know when someone says it's a plant, they mean a plant like that and not a plant that manufactures something. So the definitions and what we use for terminology is super important for these new technologies and AI and stuff to come online and be useful. So as educators, where AHPA is an educator and a lot of educators at the up top of the table, the use of terminology and making sure that we're all using common language to describe whatever data set we're publishing is super important. It'll really make these other tools come online faster for us, and they will come online, and we're going to see them. So just a comment.
Okay, thank you. So if there's no more questions, I'll set you free. I will encourage you, if you haven't already, to grab a NIST brochure or a NIST postcard. That NIST program is free. It doesn't cost anything. There's no charge. It's not a proficiency testing program, so there's no pass-fail thing. The idea is to try and give you an idea of how you're performing on your analysis and in comparison with other labs. Everything is blinded. Nobody knows if your lab does lousy work or if it does great work. Only you know your performance. That's the only part of the exercise that's unblinded. And like I said, it's free. So be free. Thank you, everybody.
Also, just an idea of whether you have type 1 or type 2 errors in your analysis.